The night the notice slid under my door, the paper whispered like a blade. I knew whose silence I would hear before dawn. I had measured my life by ledgers and favours, by the slow arithmetic of promises kept, and it was the wrong season to be short on either. Boston, in 2009, was a city of shuttered storefronts and men speaking softly in bank lobbies, the air in January tasting of metal and old coffee. I kept my coat on inside because the radiator clanked like a sick horse, and the savings that might have warmed the apartment had already been poured into the same pair of hands that once gripped mine at a courthouse door. Thomas Reed had been the name on my lips when the crisis came for him decades earlier, back in 1982, when layoffs and rising interest gnawed the town. Yet it was only now, with my knees aching and the mailbox fat with warnings, that I began to feel how memory could go threadbare. I called him in daylight, because men our age do not ask for help at night. He answered on the second ring with a voice like varnish, smooth, bright, sealing over older wood. "Henry," he said, letting my name hang. "We spoke of the weather first, because that is how New England excuses the indecent." I described the river frozen to pewter beneath the Charlestown Bridge. He spoke of a luncheon where the fish was overcooked. Just under his words lay the hum of another room, soft laughter, the clink of tempered glass, which told me he had found not only shelter from the storm, but a fireplace with well-set logs. I told him I needed a short bridge, 3 months of interest, a handshake he could put in writing later. He sighed, called me old friend, and asked for time to consider. He did not ask for details, which was a detail. The memory of 1982 arrived like a draft through a cracked window. Thomas with his sleeves rolled up, not from labour, but from the idea of it, while I signed collateral with a pen that bit my fingers. He had looked at me then as a man looks through glass at a display, hungry, dazzled, believing that proximity alone could make something his. My wife had wrapped a scarf around her hair against the snow. He had called her sister and kissed her gloved hand. That loan was paid back, every penny, and the friendship hardened around the feet like concrete settings around rebar. For years we walked those sidewalks as if we had built them. We met in person 3 days after my call, in his office along State Street, with its view of a sky the colour of paper ash. He wore a navy suit that fit like a declaration and smiled without showing teeth. When he poured coffee, he watched the stream instead of me. "It's the climate," he said at last, palms spread as if presenting weather he could not control. "The institutions are cautious. Liquidity is a skittish animal." I nodded and counted the seconds he left between sentences, the way a violinist might gauge silence before a bow. He mentioned that his own holdings were entangled, that his wife's family was anxious, that commitments must be honoured in order. His voice was so reasonable, it almost sounded like rescue. That was when I noticed the gleam of new cufflinks, small gold anchors, the kind he once mocked as gaudy, catching light as he raised his cup, and I understood he had unlearned our old language. I pressed once more, not with numbers, but with biography. I reminded him of the winter we shared a single space heater between our offices, the way we took turns thawing our hands over it, as if it were a campfire. He tapped at the desk with 2 fingers, thinking. "Henry," he said again, stretching the syllables like a bandage that had lost its stick, "I can extend advice. Advice is free." He offered me a referral to a firm that would restructure obligations and a printed list of steps that read like a prayer, written by a man who does not believe. I took the paper because I was still the man who keeps his hands open, even when they are taken for baskets. On the walk back, the wind came straight off the harbour and pinned my coat to my bones. I watched the cranes over the shipyard lift and lower nothing, as if practicing grief. At home, I placed his advice on the table and smoothed it flat with my palm. The radiator knocked once, twice, then fell quiet. I thought of the ledger we shared, the column where I had written his name in ink that did not fade, and I pictured the erasure, done not with rubber, but with a wet finger, slow, leaving a blur. An older man might have prayed. I sat with the cold and listened to it unfold like a map. When my phone remained still through evening, I knew the answer had already been spoken in a room I was not invited to enter. I tore his printed list into strips and fed it to the stove, one remnant at a time, watching each sentence blacken and curl. The flames made a patient sound, as though what they were given had long been promised. And with the weight of his refusal settling like winter over the river, I understood that something colder than debt had come for me, and I would answer it in kind. The thought did not feel like rage. It felt like arithmetic reaching the end of a column. I slept little and woke to the grey that collects behind the eyes before dawn, when the city exhales steam from manholes like the breath of buried animals. The stove had gone out. The floorboards remembered every step I had taken for years, and each creak sounded like a witness. I made tea strong enough to taste like iron and set my old ledger on the table. The pages had thinned and gone soft at the edges, the way paper does when handled by the same hands too many times. I wrote Thomas's name again, not to honour it, but to see whether the ink still took. I did not plan in a rush. Men who rush hang themselves with their first knot. I walked. I let the cold carve the cheeks and the bridge, and I watched what survived the crisis. The pawn shop doing its patient trade, the church with its doors open to the exhausted, the brokerage windows displaying certificates like portraits of ancestors. I counted who went in and who came out. Knowing how a man eats tells you how he starves. By afternoon, I stood across from his building, not to confront him, but to read his schedule by the human tide around his door. A courier with a tube under his arm, a florist's boy with frost on his knuckles, the same grey sedan idling at the curb like a held breath. I recognized his assistant's gait, urgent but careful, and the way she hovered before stepping into weather, as if sunlight were a policy she needed approved. When she crossed to the cafe, I followed not with predation, but with patience and a folded newspaper. At a small table, I opened the paper to the markets, though I already knew what they would say. Distrust was fat and fed daily. The cafe's tin ceiling reflected faces in a broken lake. The barista wrote names in chalk on cups, and the chalk dust made small storms. I ordered nothing. The assistant returned with a tray, and the door closed behind her with a hiss like a secret. That was when a man I did not know sat across from me, uninvited, and placed his gloves on the table. "Mr. Wilson," he said, not asking. "Thomas sends his regards." That was when I realized Thomas had been watching for my approach long before I arrived. His envoy introduced himself as a consultant, the sort of profession invented in good times to soften bad news. He was courteous, not kind. He spoke of options that sounded like corridors leading back to the same locked door. I let him talk until his sentences touched their own tails, then interrupted with a question that kept the room honest. "What is Thomas afraid of?" He blinked, as if someone had knocked on an interior wall. "Exposure," he said softly, before correcting himself to overexposure, a word that suggested a harmless sunburn instead of a flayed hide. He left me with a clean card I did not take. I went home and opened a wooden box I had not touched in years. Inside lay the instruments of a profession that had once kept me modest and solvent. Ruled bond paper, a brass ruler, a fountain pen with a nib sharpened by habits, and a punch that made precise holes in promises. I laid them out as a soldier might unroll a kit. The room changed when I did this, as if a candle had been lit in a place that forgot it could be warm. I began with memory because it holds better than ink. In 1982, the loan I extended Thomas had not only saved his business, it had purchased him a seat at a private auction of distressed notes, the kind of gathering where fortunes are reborn under new names. I had declined my invitation because the baby was feverish and my wife would not leave her side. He went alone, and returned wearing gratitude that fit him like a borrowed coat. What I had never admitted, not to him, not to myself, was what the paperwork from that week finally revealed when I found it folded into the ledger's back cover. The collateral he pledged for that auction was not only his, he had expanded it with a clause I had initialed without reading, allowing him to leverage my own receivables as if they were kin. The minor detail I had long forgotten was no detail at all. I held the brittle page up to the window and watched daylight crawl through the watermark. The clause was legal, barely, a thread drawn from an edge no inspector bothered to lift. My initials looked tired even then, as if the man who made them already sensed the fatigue of future explanations. I ran a finger over the ink and felt nothing, which told me everything about the kind of touch this required. That evening, I wrote a letter by hand to a man who kept his office above a shoe repair shop in Dorchester, someone who had once taught me how companies could be made to confess by the order in which you asked questions. I did not mail it, I delivered it in person, standing in a doorway that smelled of leather and glue, the bell above it giving a small, stubborn ring. The man read in silence, then nodded once and set the paper under a brass weight, shaped like a ship. We spoke little. He told me where certain debts slept and how they woke. He drew a map with stubbed pencil, the kind that smudges and therefore cannot be photocopied, and he labelled nothing. I folded the map into my coat and left before the shoemaker turned out his lights. On the walk home, the river wore a skin of ice thin enough to shiver under gulls, and somewhere beyond the bridge, a siren stitched 2 blocks together. I kept to the shadow side of the street and counted the lamps. I slept no better, but I woke with a plan that smelled like cold iron and old paper. I would not beg at doors that had once been opened with my key. I would move beneath thresholds and shift the floorboards themselves. And before the thaw came, Thomas would learn that the season had changed without asking his permission. I wrote the sentence on a scrap of brown paper and folded it into my wallet, like a small, steady flame. I began with places where paper grows teeth. The registry on Cambridge Street smelled of damp wool and toner, and the clerks wore the patience of people who have watched towns reinvent themselves on parchment. I asked for old filings, the way a parishioner asks to see a baptismal book. Boxes arrived with the slow dignity of coffins. Inside, liens, assignments, satisfactions that read like weather reports for lives I would never know. The brass ruler rasped faintly when I slid it over columns. My fountain pen, starved for years, drank names with a careful thirst. I traced Thomas through his shells and umbrellas, companies named like ships and saints, each built to carry risk just far enough from shore to feel brave. What stays hidden in any crisis is the order of footsteps. You can tell how a man fears by which debts he sets to dancing first. In the files, I found a sequence of reshuffled indentures that kept returning to a single address in Beacon Hill. A brownstone, he insisted, was his alone, the foundation of his claim to having escaped our shared steerage. The deed was clean, but the air around it wasn't. There was a tiny thread, a covenant tucked into a loan from 1996, when money fell from the sky and men traded favors like baseball cards. It tied the brownstone not to a bank, but to a holding company with a plain name and an office above a hardware store in Quincy. I knew the smell of such offices: oil soap, graphite, the sweetness of paper dust. The clause was narrow as a blade and twice as patient. At a bank on Milk Street, I asked to speak with someone whose job required him to read past the first paragraph. I wore my courthouse coat and an expression that suggested I had nowhere better to be. We sat at a desk beneath a mute photograph of a lighthouse. He slid statements toward me, each with enough white space to make a man feel small, and waited out my silence, the way fishermen wait out fog. That was when he leaned in and, without ceremony, addressed me by the nickname only Thomas had ever used, as if the walls themselves remembered our old proximity. I blinked and let the name pass over me like a cold hand. You know him, I said, not as a question. The banker smiled the careful smile of a man who keeps both day and night ledgers. We know everyone, he said, and then, as if adjusting the weight of his own honesty, he added, we know who will still be standing come spring. He would not assist me. He did something better. He declined the wrong question with such precision that the right one rose of its own accord. I asked about assignments, not loans. He showed me a record of debts sleeping inside debts, and I marked the entry that mentioned the Quincy Company by its initials, which read, like a confession uttered in a hurry. I left through revolving doors that spun me into air sharp enough to edit a man. The streetcar rattled past with faces pressed to glass like museum specimens. Back home, I spread the copies on the table and made small mountains with brass clips. I did not think in terms of revenge. I thought in terms of rearrangement, of sliding a single card and watching the structure remember gravity. The map from Dorchester, penciled without labels, began to behave like music. I could hear where to place the next note. Near dusk, while the snow turned the windows to frosted panes, I walked to the Quincy address. The hardware store's bell stuttered when I entered. The proprietor was wrapping twine for a woman who smelled of laundry and rain. I asked, casually, whether the upstairs office kept regular hours. He shrugged toward the staircase with a gesture learned from a lifetime of shrugging, small, decisive, absolving him of drama. The stairs creaked with the honesty of old pine. At the top, a glass door bore painted letters in a color that had once been black. Inside sat a woman in a cardigan mended at the elbows, her desk clean enough to be a warning. She looked up and waited for me to declare my purpose, which is how honest gatekeepers test the guilty. I introduced myself with the dignity of my actual name, not the one men use when pretending to be larger. I said I wished to inquire about a dormant obligation that might be available for purchase. She did not ask which. She reached into a drawer and removed a thin folder, already bearing my surname. It should have chilled me. It steadied me instead. The paper inside smelled faintly of mildew and time. The obligation was small, almost insulting in its modesty. A junior note secured by a cross-default clause that touched Thomas's brownstone only if another, older instrument hiccuped. But stapled to the back with the violence of a single, misplaced swing were copies from 1982, the season of my first rescue, showing my initials affixed to a rider I had never seen. The ink bled slightly, as if it had been applied in a room with too much steam. The detail that altered the shape of the room was the second set of initials beside mine, my wife's, curled with a grace she rarely used outside of birthday cards. I felt the floor nudge upward, a building's subtle protest when its history is misfiled. My wife had not set foot in that office in 1982. The baby's fever had married her to the kitchen chair. The signature was not a forgery of her hand. It was a tracing of her patience, lifted from a charity ledger she had kept for our parish. Thomas had not only borrowed my name, he had lifted hers with the quiet disrespect of a man pocketing a spoon at the end of a dinner. I closed the folder gently, the way you close eyes. I asked for the assignment price in a voice that belonged to weather, not a man. The woman named a sum that suggested she had been waiting for someone like me since the 19th century. I paid without bargaining. Some dignity is purchased by refusing to haggle over the instrument you intend to use. Night gathered early, the way it does when snow threatens. I walked home under a sky the color of pewter, feeling the map in my coat like a heartbeat out of rhythm, and I understood that to wake the right debt, I first had to make a smaller one breathe. The thought sat in my chest like a coal cupped in ash, holding heat without drawing attention. I rose before light and wrote out a notice by hand. The script deliberate, the clauses copied from memory rather than law books, because memory forgives nothing. The junior note from Quincy was a faint pulse. All it required was a measured tap at the artery. I dated it, folded it once, and sealed it with wax as if I were sending an old country letter. In the mirror, I tied my scarf the way my wife used to, one knot low, a habit that kept the neck honest. Then I walked through streets the snow had bleached quiet, and I watched my breath go out ahead of me like scouts. At the brownstone, I did not pause to admire the brickwork Thomas boasted about at dinners. I slipped the notice through the brass slot and heard it slide onto tile with a sound like the first coin of an evening. The clause I had purchased demanded an opportunity to cure a trivial delinquency on an older instrument no one had looked at in a decade. Trivial is a word men use when they think their shadow will keep its shape in every light. I stood for a minute, counting the steps I'd taken up from the sidewalk, then turned away before the house could learn my shape. I spent the morning at the courthouse because courts keep the weather of a city hung in their halls. Wet umbrellas, thawing boots, patience wrung like cloth. I filed the copy and obtained the stamp that turns private intention into public posture. The clerk, a pale woman with a smile like a straight edge, held my gaze for a fraction longer than custom allows. "You're early," she said. "Early is kinder than late," I answered, and the line behind me shifted, like a body taking a breath. That was when I felt watched. Not by Thomas's men, but by the past. Precisely when I caught a glimpse of my wife's handwriting in a ledger inside the records room. The curve of her S, as particular as the way she used to slice apples. I followed that curve as if it were a path. The ledger belonged to a notary who had kept an office near Faneuil Hall in the early 80s, a man known for never turning down winter work. The entry for 1982 recorded 3 signatures witnessed on a rider attached to a revolving facility, Thomas's, mine, and my wife's, beside a notary seal pressed so deeply the paper still held the dent. But below, in a smaller hand, the notary had added a private memorandum, not meant for courts. Payment received in cash from parish benevolence account as retainer. Client insists it is customary. My skin remembered cold in a way the room could not. The minor error I had forgiven as carelessness shifted into a theft that had worn my wife's good work like a mask. I closed the book and asked to see the notary's file index, my voice steady, because a steady voice makes strangers believe you will share the burden of what they hand you. The attendant brought me a box of thin folders, bound with decency's ribbon, twine. Inside the folder, for that month, lay a receipt on onion skin paper, naming me as authorizer for the retainer. The signature was mine and not mine. My angles, my haste, but with a flourish I never used except on birthday envelopes to my daughter. Thomas had not only lifted a signature, he had rehearsed my affection until he could counterfeit it. On State Street, the wind came hard around the corners and made the flags talk to themselves. I thought of the parish treasurer in 1982, an old sea captain type who believed every ledger was a moral object, and how he had died convinced the shortfall that winter was a rounding error caused by generosity. I carried the folder's memory in my coat as if it were contraband, and I let the knowledge clarify me rather than rot me. In the afternoon, I returned to Quincy with a small purchase, a box of brass fasteners, the kind clerks use to make thin papers behave like thick ones. The woman upstairs took my payment for the assignment in the same plain room where truth wears a cardigan. "It's an old string," she said, almost kindly. "Says sometimes old strings hold the heavier weights." I nodded and slid the assignment into my briefcase, the one Thomas once gave me after a luncheon he could not afford in 1985, the leather still smelling faintly of smoke and lemon. Near dusk, I watched the brownstone from across the street, a figure under a street lamp acting his age, not his intention. A housekeeper came and went with a sack of oranges. A man in a hat I did not recognize lingered at the gate, then left with the careful steps of someone who had been told to appear casual. No one opened the door to lift my notice from the tile. Men like Thomas consider paper dangerous only when it arrives with witnesses. I slept in small rations and woke to a city singing in radiators. By noon, a courier delivered a letter on thick stock requesting a meeting. The tone a tutor's, brisk, civil, confident that I had miscalculated. I set it aside and walked instead to the parish where my wife had kept her books. The new treasurer, a woman with eyes like dull coins polished by use, led me to a back room where the old ledgers were stacked like hymnals. I opened to the winter of 1982 and found the shortfall circled in pencil with a note to investigate after Thor. There was no second circle. The Thor must have cleaned consciences along with streets. I left the church with my hands empty and my pockets heavy with intention. Thomas would call soon, not out of fear, but habit, and I needed to choose what to expose first. The forgery that stained a good woman's ledger, or the clause that could make a house remember its true owner. And as the light thinned to pewter over the river, I knew I would make him choose which memory he could afford to keep. The sentence repeated in my head, like a tolling bell, as I prepared for the meeting his letter demanded. I did not answer immediately. Men like Thomas are accustomed to the quick compliance of those who fear exclusion. To make him wait was to turn the key slowly in the lock. I let 2 days pass, each filled with errands that had nothing to do with the brownstone, or the clause, or the ledger, and everything to do with walking past his office without entering. The wind off the harbour carried a smell like old rope, and it pleased me to imagine he could not know whether I was circling or drifting away. When I finally agreed to meet, I chose the location. A corner table in a back room of a club he had once been blackballed from in 1984, only to gain entry years later when his name was printed in enough places. It was a room panelled in dark walnut, with brass sconces that burned light like low wine. I arrived early enough to watch the waiter polish glasses with the reverence of a sacristan. He came 10 minutes late, wearing a charcoal suit with a pocket square the colour of denial. His greeting was warm enough to thaw thin ice, but not deep enough to drink from. "Henry," he said, lowering himself into the chair, "we have loose threads to address." I let him talk. He spoke of misunderstandings, of ancient paperwork, of clerical habits that might have produced appearances. He said nothing of my wife's ledger, though the way he avoided her name told me he had heard the whisper of it already. I sipped coffee, gone lukewarm, my fingers steady on the handle. That was when he leaned forward, lowering his voice, and I caught the faintest trace of fear under the cologne. He wanted the clause. That was clear. He offered me a settlement number, more than pocket change, less than restitution. He framed it as mutually beneficial closure, a phrase that belongs to accountants and men who cannot bear the sight of open doors. I shook my head once, not in refusal, but in the kind of pause that makes the other man fill the air with more than he intended. "You've misunderstood," I said. "I'm not selling. I'm deciding." His eyes narrowed in the way they had back in 1982, when I told him the repayment schedule would be strict. That year, he had agreed only because he still needed the rope I was holding. Now, he reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the table. It was a copy of the junior note, marked "paid" in red across the face. Except the signature of the payee was not mine. It was my wife's hand again, or rather, the shape of it, looped in a way only he would dare attempt twice. The air in the room shifted. I did not touch the paper. "You've been practicing," I said. His shoulders made the smallest movement, less than a shrug, more than a tremor. I told him there was no undoing the handwriting of a good woman once it was set into the public record, no matter how many false strokes you layered over it. "You could burn every page," I said, "and it would still exist in the eye of anyone who ever saw it." He said nothing. The walnut walls seemed to lean in. Outside the door, cutlery clinked in measured rhythm, like the counting of coins. We ended without agreement. He left first, his coat collar turned up as if the room itself had chilled him. I stayed, letting the scent of walnut and brass fill my lungs, memorizing the precise temperature of the air between us. That evening, A car idled across from my building longer than courtesy permits. I watched from behind the curtain, the driver's face lit by the green glow of a dashboard clock. Eventually, he pulled away, the tires making no sound on the snow. I knew then that Thomas would not sleep until he recovered the claws or neutralized me entirely, but he did not yet understand that the claws was not the only thing breathing in my possession. The forged signatures were the marrow of this matter, and marrow, once exposed, does not heal quietly. So I began drafting two separate packets, one for the bank, holding the senior instrument tied to his brownstone, another for the parish archive, where a new treasurer might recognize the wound in her predecessor's books. I worked under the yellow light of my desk lamp, the shadows falling across my hands like the bars of a patient cage. The question was no longer whether I would act, but in what order the revelations should arrive. And as I sealed the first envelope with a press of my thumb, I realized that the sequence would decide not only how he fell, but how long he heard himself falling. That realization made my pulse slow, as if my body understood the precision required for the work ahead. The first packet was for the parish, but it would not travel directly. I addressed it in a steady hand, then slipped it into a second envelope without markings. This one would pass through a friend in Charlestown, a retired auditor whose sense of moral outrage had not dulled with age. He would know exactly how to place it, so the treasurer's eyes found it without the stink of a personal vendetta. The second packet, for the bank, remained on my desk while I refined the language, pairing it until every sentence was a lever rather than a plea. I moved with deliberate slowness. In my younger years, I might have rushed, driven by the hunger to see the first crack form in the enemy's wall. But revenge, like finance, benefits from compounding. The snow outside deepened overnight. In the morning, the city was muffled, the street lamps still lit against a sky the color of unpolished pewter. I dressed in layers and walked to the post office, the envelopes hidden inside a folded newspaper. No one noticed me. Anonymity is the last privilege of age. At the counter, the clerk stamped the parish envelope without looking at the name. I watched the red ink bloom on the paper, a mark that said, "This thing was now in motion, subject to the laws of distance and arrival." That was when a figure stepped into the post office behind me. A man in a camel hair coat, his face mostly hidden by the tilt of his hat. I caught only his reflection in the glass door, but the posture was unmistakable. Thomas had sent someone to watch. I did not turn. I finished my transaction, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the snow without changing pace. On the corner, I took a detour down an alley where the drifts had erased the path. My boots made a new trail, one that led through a service entrance of an old hotel. Inside, the heat struck me like a sudden confession, and I lingered in the lobby, long enough to be sure the camel hair coat did not follow. Back home, I locked the door and drew the curtains. The second packet waited under the desk lamp, its edges sharp against the wood. I thought of sending it immediately, but instinct told me to wait. Let the parish note land first, stir the sediment, and cloud the water before the bank received its portion. Confusion, after all, can be as destructive as exposure. That evening, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the line was young, male, professional, yet every sentence had the faint echo of someone else's script. He said he represented a mutual acquaintance who wished to avoid unnecessary escalation. I asked him to name the acquaintance. He hesitated just long enough to answer my real question. "What does Thomas want?" I asked. The young man exhaled audibly. "He's willing to discuss terms," he said, "but only if certain documents remain private." I let silence fill the line until I could hear his breathing change. Then I told him terms were irrelevant until certain wrongs were named out loud. "When he can say my wife's name without choking on it," I said, "he can call me himself." I hung up before he could answer. That night I slept well for the first time in months. In the morning, I rose before dawn, and placed the second packet into my coat pocket. The snow had begun to melt into slush, the streets streaked with the grime of passing cars. At the bank, I asked for the manager by name. He led me to a glass-walled office where the sound of the lobby dulled to a hum. I laid the packet on his desk without explanation. He read the first page, then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since the early 80s, a mixture of recognition and caution. "This could change ownership," he said quietly. "It could," I agreed, "and the longer you wait, the messier the title becomes." He nodded once and slid the packet into a locked drawer. "We'll be in touch." As I stepped out into the brittle sunlight, I felt no satisfaction, only the steadiness of a wheel beginning to turn. I knew Thomas would hear about the bank visit within the day, and that he would finally understand the clock was no longer set to his time. And walking home, the sound of my boots in the slush reminded me that the next step was not to watch him fall, but to decide how far down the shaft I would let him drop before sealing it shut. That decision was not one to be made in haste, for the depth of a man's fall dictates the echo it leaves behind. The snow melt had turned the streets into mirrors, and as I walked, my reflection wavered with every step, reminding me that perception was as fragile as footing. Thomas would already be aware of my visit to the bank, but not of the sequence in which I intended to play my hand. That was my advantage. He was forced to react while I chose the order of revelations. I stopped by a tobacconist on Tremont Street, a place where old men lingered over the day's news, their voices low and their hearing selective. There, I learned that two of Thomas's lesser holdings, quiet ventures meant to feed the larger beast, had been put on the market quietly. The kind of discreet disposal a man attempts when liquidity has turned to quicksand. He was shoring up walls, but he hadn't yet realized that the foundations were already shifting under him. In the afternoon, I returned to the parish, not to speak with the treasurer, but to stand in the nave while the choir rehearsed. The voices rose like clean linen on a line, and I thought of my wife's hands folded over the ledger, decades ago, her penmanship a small, stubborn act of order in a winter that had no mercy. It reminded me why certain debts could not be settled with money alone. That was when I saw the treasurer herself step into the aisle, a white envelope in her hand and her brow drawn tight. She didn't see me in the shadows, but I saw the way she turned the envelope over twice before slipping it into her bag. My parish packet had landed. I left before she noticed me. Timing mattered now. The bank would move cautiously, the parish more instinctively. Thomas would feel the pressure on two fronts, without knowing which blow would land first. By evening, I had my answer about the depth of his fall. It would be to the very bottom. There was no value in leaving him, with a platform to rebuild from. The man who had signed my wife's name without her presence, who had drawn from charity to feed ambition, deserved the kind of ending that made even his allies step back from the carcass. That night, the telephone rang. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice, steady but tight, came without preamble. "We need to speak," he said. "We already have," I replied. "This isn't a negotiation anymore," he said, and I could hear the strain of someone trying to compress rage into civility. "No," I agreed. "It's a reckoning." A long pause, then. "Henry, if you think you can—" I cut him off. "Think? I've already acted. You'll feel it before you see it, Thomas. That's how rot works." He hung up first. I slept in short bursts, my dreams threaded with the sound of dripping water and footsteps on tile. When morning came, the city was wrapped in fog, and the world felt smaller, closer, as though the buildings had drawn in to listen. I took a trolley to the waterfront and walked along the pier, letting the smell of salt and rust clear my head. At Pier 14, I met the retired auditor from Charlestown. He wore a fisherman's cap and carried a satchel that had known too many winters. Without a word, he handed me a folded newspaper. Inside, between the pages, was confirmation that the parish treasurer had already taken my packet to the diocese. It would be handled internally first, but internal storms have a way of blowing open shutters. Next, he asked. The bank, I said, and then whatever's left. He nodded once, his eyes narrowing as if focusing on some far horizon. When you drop him, make sure he knows it's you. I told him that was the point. On the ride home, I thought about the shaft again. The slow descent, the echo stretching out long after the body hits bottom, and I knew the ceiling of that shaft would be my last act, a gesture done not for closure, but to make certain nothing ever climbed back up. The thought followed me into the next morning, settling into the corners of my mind like dust that would never be swept away. The bank moved faster than I expected. By the time I reached my kitchen table with the first cup of coffee, a discreet envelope had been slid under my door. Inside was a formal notice. The senior instrument tied to the brownstone was under review for breach of covenant. It was not an accusation. It was a warning, the kind sent before weather changes. The paper was smooth, the language cold, and in it I could feel the tightening of the noose, one loop at a time. Thomas would know by now. He would pace the length of his walnut-panelled office, his mind crawling over possibilities. He might suspect my hand, but he could not yet prove it. That was the advantage of precision. You could cut deep without showing the blade. I decided the next move would not be mine directly. It would come from a distance, through someone he would never imagine could be reached. That meant calling on Margaret Dwyer, a name no one in his circle had spoken in 30 years. She had been his bookkeeper in the years before. I ever loaned him a cent. A woman with a memory for numbers, so exact she could recite ledger lines as if they were poetry. When he discarded her in favor of a cheaper, less principled accountant, she took her skills to a shipping firm in Gloucester and her silence to the graveyard of grudges. It took me half the day to find her. She lived in a narrow house that smelled faintly of brine and mothballs, its walls lined with shelves of bound account books that looked more like novels. She answered the door with a cautious squint that softened only when I gave my name. "You're late," she said. "For what?" "For the reckoning," she replied, and stepped aside to let me in. That was when I realized Margaret had been keeping her own watch on Thomas all these years. Over tea gone strong from steeping too long, she opened a drawer in her desk and produced a thin folder. Inside were copies of old payroll records, invoices, and a letter of resignation she'd never sent. In her precise script, she had annotated each document with dates, names, and small notations about off-book transfers that even I had never known about. She had been waiting for someone to ask. One entry caught my eye. November 1982, a week after I'd given Thomas the Lifeline loan. Margaret had recorded a movement of funds from parish reserve account into his personal line, Master's reimbursement for event catering. The amount matched exactly the shortfall my wife had discovered in her charity ledger. I felt my hands still against the paper. Here was the missing hinge, the piece that connected the forgery, the clause and the debt into one continuous door. Margaret watched me read, her expression unreadable. "If you're going to use it," she said, "don't waste it on humiliation. Hit him where he has to bleed the longest." "I intend to," I answered. When I left her house, the wind off the water smelled like rust and wet rope, the same as it had in that bitter winter decades ago. The tide was low, and the rocks along the shore glistened like blackened coins. I thought about how every step I had taken in the past months had led me here, to a piece of proof so sharp it could split the timeline of our lives into before and after. Back home, I placed Margaret's documents with the others, aligning the edges until they formed a perfect stack. The plan was now complete. The parish investigation would shake his reputation. The bank review would threaten his home. And this would strip the last layer of respectability from his skin. But I would not drop all three at once. The order mattered. The first crack had to come from a place he couldn't defend against without exposing himself to the next blow. Timing was the art. That evening, I lit the single lamp on my desk and began drafting the letter that would carry Margaret's proof to exactly the right hands. Someone with just enough power to act and just enough ambition to make it public. The pen moved steadily, the nib scratching a rhythm that matched my breathing. When I sealed the envelope, I knew the moment it was opened would mark the point where Thomas stopped falling in stages and began to plummet in one uninterrupted drop. And the only question left, the one I would not answer until the last possible moment, was whether I would let him hear the latch slide shut above him. That thought stayed with me all night, circling like a hawk that refused to land. By dawn, the fog had rolled in from the harbour, muting the city to a whisper. The streets glistened with damp, and the lamps burned longer than they should, their light a pale imitation of day. I carried the sealed envelope containing Margaret's proof in my inner coat pocket, the weight of it pressing against my ribs like a concealed blade. I didn't take it directly to its destination. Instead, I moved through the city in a slow, deliberate pattern, watching for tails, measuring my steps. Men like Thomas never rely on one watcher. They plant three, each ignorant of the other. At a street corner, I paused to watch a busker tuning his guitar. The reflection in the shop window across from him confirmed my suspicion. Same camel hair coat, same slow orbit. I let him follow me to the South Station concourse, where the noise and movement swallowed every distinct shadow. Slipping between two trains boarding on adjacent platforms, I vanished into a service stairwell and emerged on Atlantic Avenue, free of his gaze. It wasn't just caution. It was important that Thomas believe I had been headed nowhere. The letter's true recipient worked inside a modest building near the courthouse, a place where civic ambition and private grudges intersected daily. I didn't go in myself. Instead, I left the envelope with a messenger I trusted, a man who once carried ledgers for my firm, back when I still believed in balance sheets that matched. He asked no questions, just pocketed the fee and walked off at a pace that would carry the truth to the exact desk I'd chosen. That was when the midday air shifted, warmer, heavy with the metallic scent that comes before rain. My boots carried me back toward the waterfront, where gulls wheeled above the masts and the tide pressed hard against the pilings. Standing there, I thought of Thomas's office, the polished walnut walls holding in the heat, while outside, the foundations of his empire began to sweat under the pressure. By late afternoon, my phone rang. It wasn't Thomas. It was the banker, the same man who'd locked my packet in his desk. His voice was flatter than before, the pleasantries stripped away. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "there have been developments. Your timing appears to have been prescient." He didn't explain, and I didn't press. The less he told me, the more I knew. That evening, I received word from Margaret. Not directly, but through a note slipped under my door in her exact, disciplined handwriting. "He's calling old debts in every direction. Must be feeling the water rise. No signature, no date. Just that single sentence, sharp as a nail." It was confirmation enough. The parish had stirred, the bank was moving, and now the proof I'd placed in the right hands would begin to thread its way into the places where gossip becomes record. I sat at my desk under the dim lamp, spreading the remaining documents in front of me like a hand of cards. Each one was a strike, but together they were a sentence. No appeal, no delay. I could deliver them all at once and crush him instantly, but there was more to be gained in letting the panic erode his footing. Men rarely fall clean. They stumble, claw, and drag others down with them. The more time he spent flailing, the more of his circle would decide it was safer to let go than to be pulled under. Night came heavy with the smell of rain. I stood at the window and watched the street empty, the wet pavement reflecting the dim light above. Somewhere out there, Thomas was recalculating, shifting assets, whispering to allies he could no longer trust. I thought again of the latch, the sound it would make as it slid into place, and I knew with a calm that felt almost ceremonial, that he would hear it. Not at the bottom, but just as the last light went out above him, leaving him to understand there would be no way back up. The timing had to be perfect, because once the latch slid, there would be no undoing it. The next morning brought news faster than I expected. The paper, buried halfway through the business section, carried a small notice about an internal parish audit and the reassignment of certain financial duties. No names were printed, but the phrasing was damning for anyone who could read between the lines. To the public, it was just a line of administrative reshuffling. To Thomas, it was a crack in the ceiling, dripping steadily onto his desk. I spent the day in the public records office, combing through property filings. There, it was in black ink, a pending review status attached to the brownstone's deed. It was the kind of bureaucratic footnote most people ignore until it strangles a sale or a refinancing. For Thomas, it meant the walls he had built to keep creditors out were now under quiet inspection from the inside. By noon, I received a second note from Margaret, hand-delivered by a boy from the docks who knew nothing of its meaning. He's been on the telephone all morning, 4 calls overseas. Someone's not answering. It was the first real sign of desperation. He was looking for safe ground beyond reach, and finding none. That was when I decided it was time for the last of my pieces to move into position. I still had documents, copies of the forged signatures, the notary's memorandum, and Margaret's annotated payroll sheets, that had not yet seen the light. I knew exactly where they would cause the most damage. The desk of a city councilman with a taste for public crusades and an eye on higher office. Men like that understood how to sharpen facts into weapons without ever appearing to touch them. I took the trolley to City Hall, my briefcase clasped like a priest carrying relics. Inside, the corridors echoed with footsteps and the low murmur of clerks. I left the envelope with the councilman's aide, a woman whose face betrayed neither curiosity nor disinterest. "Tell him," I said, "that it's about a building on Beacon Hill." I didn't wait for her to ask which. That evening, as the rain finally broke, I walked past the brownstone. Light glowed in the windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. I imagined Thomas inside, pacing the polished floors, the reflection of his own movements repeating endlessly in the glass, making him believe for a moment that someone else was in the room with him. The following morning, the telephone rang, just after 7. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "Henry," he began, "this has gone too far." "No," I said, "it's gone exactly far enough." "You think you've boxed me in," he said, "but I still have friends." "You had friends," I corrected. "What you have now are people deciding how close they want to be when the roof comes down." He exhaled, long and slow. "You won't win anything from this. Nothing worth the trouble." "That depends on what you think I'm after," I said. We both knew the answer. It wasn't money. It was weight. The kind of weight that settles on a man's name so thoroughly it can't be lifted, even by time. After the call, I sat by the window and watched the street. No watchers today. That was more telling than their presence. It meant he was pulling his men back, keeping them close. Hoarding resources for the storm he now believed was inevitable. Late in the afternoon, the councilman's aide called. Her voice was brisk. "He's seen the documents. He wants to meet." The tone told me she understood more than she was saying. I agreed to the meeting, but not for the reasons she thought. By then, the shaft was nearly sealed. The light above was thinning, and Thomas, whether he knew it or not, was already standing in the dark, listening for the sound that would tell him. The way up was gone forever. I carried that image with me into the councilman's office the following afternoon, where the air smelled faintly of old books and polished brass. He sat behind a desk that seemed deliberately too large, forcing visitors to cross an expanse before reaching him. His smile was professional, his eyes weighing me as he gestured to the chair opposite. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "your packet was illuminating." I watched him as he leafed through the copies I had provided, pausing at the payroll annotations, then the notary's memorandum, then the forged signatures. His fingers lingered over my wife's name in that false hand, as if even he could feel the insult pressed into the paper. "That's the kind of thing," he said quietly, "that changes how people talk about a man. Permanently." "That's the idea," I replied. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It's clean, verifiable, and tied neatly enough to current events that no one could mistake it for an old grudge." I didn't tell him it was an old grudge, older than some of the clerks in his building, because the truth of age doesn't lessen the sharpness of a blade. I simply asked, "Will you act?" He smiled the way men do when they've already decided, but want you to think. "You've convinced them." "This will move," he said, "but slowly, in the open. That way, when the floor drops out from under him, everyone will swear they saw it coming." That was when I knew he understood exactly the kind of fall I had planned. Leaving City Hall, the wind carried the distant clang of a ship's bell. The harbour air bit at my face, and the light had that flat winter quality that makes every shadow look honest. I walked without hurry, taking a long route home, letting the city's rhythm steady my own. When I reached my building, another note was waiting under the door. Margaret's hand again. "He's making offers. To everyone. Discounts. Favours. Repayment in kind. They smell blood." I read it twice, then burned it in the stove. Fire consumed the paper quickly, curling it into black petals. The ash settled like the end of a sentence. That night, I allowed myself a single glass of whiskey, the first in months, and sat in the darkened kitchen. I could almost hear the movement inside Thomas's world. Calls made and not returned. Meetings where voices lowered when his name came up. The brownstone must have begun to feel smaller, its walls closer, the windows showing more of the night than the street. In the morning, the newspaper carried a piece on emerging irregularities in several Beacon Hill property holdings, buried beneath the main headlines, but just high enough for those who mattered to notice. They hadn't printed his name yet, but the coordinates were there for anyone with a map. By mid-afternoon, he called again. His tone was no longer that of a man bargaining. It was the brittle voice of someone trying to slow a clock he couldn't see. "Henry, let's end this before it ruins us both." "There's no both here, Thomas," I said. "Just you. I'll give you whatever you want." I almost laughed. "You've been giving me what I want for weeks. You just haven't realized it." Silence stretched, then the line went dead. That evening, the fog returned, thicker than before, muting the lamps and swallowing sound. I walked down to the river, the water barely visible, and thought of the shaft again. The darkness, the narrowing walls, the sound of air being sealed away, and I knew the next step would be the final push, the one that made the fall irreversible, even if some part of him still thought he could climb. That thought was not a thrill. It was a weight settling into place, the closing of a lock you had tested for years. I woke early, the fog still pressing against the windows, and laid out the last of my documents on the table. They formed a map, each page a coordinate that, when joined, marked the exact point where Thomas's footing would give way. This wasn't about noise anymore. It was about silence. The kind that follows a public revelation, so complete that no one bothers to ask questions. They just step aside as the man disappears from their company. The councilman had done his part. The bank was tightening its review. The parish had already set its quiet machinery in motion. Now it was time for the press. Just enough light to make the darkness that followed feel earned. I had a contact at the Boston Ledger, a columnist with an appetite for scandal that was tempered by an instinct for accuracy. He would not run the story unless every corner was clean. I intended to give him a house without a single shadow left unexplored. I carried the file in an unmarked folder, the edges wrapped with twine. Walking to the Ledger's office on Devonshire Street, I felt no urgency. Timing was precise, but there was no need to rush a clock already set in motion. Inside, the newsroom was warm with the smell of ink and the low clatter of keyboards. I found him at his desk, his tie askew, glasses low on his nose. When I set the folder before him, he didn't touch it right away. "I hear this is the one people will talk about," he said. "They'll do more than talk," I replied. He untied the twine, leafed through the documents, and stopped at the forged signature. My wife's name. His mouth tightened, not in judgment, but in recognition of the audacity. "You want it buried in the Sunday edition, or loud on page 3? "Loud," I said. So loud he can't pretend he didn't hear it. That was when I knew the latch was nearly in place. Leaving the office, I turned toward the harbour. The air had shifted again, less damp, more brittle. Winter was breaking, but the ground beneath Thomas's world was not thawing, it was collapsing. That afternoon, I received a call from Margaret. No greeting, no pleasantries. "He sold the brownstone," she said. "He can't," I replied. "The bank—" "He found a buyer willing to gamble on clearing the title later. Private, cash." It was desperation, pure and raw, and it confirmed I had struck deeper than he'd admitted. A man who sells his fortress sells the illusion that built it. I spent the evening preparing my final letter, not to Thomas, but to the buyer. A simple, factual notice outlining the pending review, the irregularities, and the potential liabilities that would attach to any transfer. No accusations, no adjectives, just the kind of cold truth that chills the ink as it dries. When I dropped it in the post before midnight, the streets were empty, the lamps standing like sentinels. Somewhere in the city, Thomas would be convincing himself the sale was his escape route. By the time the letter reached its destination, that route would be bricked over. Back home, I sat in the dark, the papers cleared from the table. The shaft was sealed in all but sound. The air above him was already thin. I imagined him standing in that last circle of light, wondering which stone would move first. And I promised myself that when it did, I would be there, not to watch him fall, but to make sure he heard the latch slide shut. That promise had been a whisper in my head for months, but now it felt carved into the inside of my ribs. The Sunday edition of the Boston Ledger hit the stands before dawn. I bought my copy from the kiosk on Tremont, the paper still damp from the press. Page 3 was as promised. The headline tight, the language precise, the facts arranged like a firing squad. They had not needed to name him in the title. The details made it impossible for anyone in Boston's upper circles to mistake who the subject was. By mid-morning, I heard the first ripples. A call from a former associate. Not one I trusted, but one who still had ears in the right rooms. "They're not defending him," he said. "They're deciding how much to pretend they never knew him." It was exactly what I wanted. In my experience, the death of a man's reputation isn't a roar. It's the quiet sound of chairs scraping back as people leave the table. I spent the day walking the city, letting the rhythm of my steps settle the weight of what I'd done. On Beacon Street, I passed a cafe where Thomas and I had once sat discussing his first expansion, him full of plans, me quietly calculating how much rope to give him. The windows were fogged now, the chairs half empty, and I wondered if he'd even dare to be seen there anymore. That was when I spotted him, across the street, stepping out of a car I didn't recognize. He looked smaller, somehow, though he was dressed as sharply as ever. Our eyes met for the briefest moment before he turned away, speaking quickly to the driver. It wasn't fear in his face, it was recognition. He knew this wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. He knew I was the one tightening the air around him. In the afternoon, I received a call from the councilman's aide. Her voice had an edge of satisfaction. The buyer backed out of the brownstone deal, no explanation given. I didn't need one. My letter had landed. By evening, the rain returned, tapping against the windows like a reminder. I sat at my desk, the last remaining file in front of me. It contained nothing new, just copies of every piece I had sent out, each marked with the date it was delivered. A record, for myself, of how the shaft had been closed. Then the telephone rang. His voice was hoarse, almost raw. "Henry," he said, "there's nothing left to take." "That's the point," I answered. A long pause. I could hear the faint echo of a room too empty to absorb sound. "You think this ends it?" he asked. "No," I said. "This ends you." He didn't hang up right away. I imagined him sitting there, phone pressed to his ear, waiting for me to offer some reprieve, but I had nothing left to give him. Eventually, the line went dead, and I knew he'd heard the sound I'd promised, the latch closing. That night, I stood at the window and watched the fog roll over the river. Somewhere in the city, Thomas was looking at his own reflection, realizing the lights above him were gone. And I knew the next time I saw him, it would not be as an adversary, but as something smaller, a man who had already fallen, still waiting to hit the bottom. That image stayed with me, sharper than pity, colder than satisfaction. 2 days passed before our paths crossed again. I wasn't seeking him. The city is smaller than it pretends to be, and Boston, in winter, has a way of folding familiar faces into familiar streets. I was walking along Court Street when I saw him emerge from a doorway, his coat collar up, his step hesitant. The man beside him, a lawyer I recognized from the darker corners of real estate disputes, was speaking quickly, head bent toward him as if urging him to keep moving. He didn't see me at first. His gaze was fixed on the pavement, as though watching his own feet would prevent another step from being stolen. But when he looked up and our eyes met, there was no flicker of the old defiance, no careful performance of control, just the stunned awareness of someone who has been living inside the echo of a collapse. I didn't approach. Some defeats need distance to be complete. I simply stepped aside, letting him pass, and listened to the sound of his shoes fade into the street noise. That afternoon, Margaret telephoned for the first time instead of sending notes. "It's done," she said. "The parish has confirmed the audit results. His name won't be printed, but everyone who needs to know already knows." "And the bank?" I asked. "They've frozen the line on the brownstone. Titles under full review." There was a pause on the line, softer than hesitation. "You've stripped him clean, Henry. More than I thought possible." I didn't answer right away. My eyes were on the river outside my window, the surface broken by slow-moving sheets of ice. "It's not about stripping him," I said. "It's about making sure nothing grows back." That night, I walked past the brownstone one last time. The curtains were open now, but the rooms inside were mostly dark. In the front hall, a single lamp burned low, casting just enough light to show the absence of furniture. The house felt hollow, as if it had already been abandoned in spirit, if not yet in fact. I stood there long enough to feel the cold settle into my bones. Somewhere inside, I imagined him pacing, not with the nervous energy of a man plotting his return, but with the restless aimlessness of someone who doesn't know where to go next. When I finally turned away, the street was empty. The fog had lifted, leaving the air sharp and bare. I walked without hurry, the sound of my steps loud in the stillness. At home, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. No files, no evidence, no strategy, just space. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about the next move. The game was over. What remained was only the weight of having played it, to the very end. I poured myself another whiskey and let it warm me. In the quiet, I could still hear the faint echo of his voice from that last call. There's nothing left to take. And perhaps he had been right. I had taken everything worth having, not for myself, but from him. Still, I knew there was one last meeting ahead. Not by arrangement, but by the inevitability of small cities and long memories. And when it came, I would see him not as the man who once stood beside me, but as the shadow left after the fall. I didn't have to wait long for that moment. It was a week later, in Quincy Market of all places, a public stage with too much light for private conversations and too little dignity for confessions. I had stopped to buy bread, the kind with a crust that sounds like breaking ice, when I felt the shift in air that comes from someone watching you. I turned, and there he was. No suit this time, a coat that didn't quite fit, hair in need of a trim, the faint sag of shoulders that had carried too much for too long. His eyes found mine, and for a heartbeat I saw the ghost of who he had been. The charm, the calculation, but it flickered and was gone. He approached without hesitation, though his steps lacked force. Henry, he said, and it was not a greeting so much as a statement that I still existed in his world, however shrunken that world had become. We stood in the shadow of the market's granite columns while tourists passed, oblivious to the quiet history between us. "I suppose you're satisfied," he said. His tone wasn't bitter. It was tired, as though even resentment cost more than he could spare. I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said. "Satisfied is the wrong word. This wasn't about feeling better. It was about making it true." He nodded slowly, as if that made sense to him in a way it hadn't before. "You could have ended it sooner." "I could have," I agreed, "but you would have thought you'd survived." His gaze dropped to the cobblestones. "There's nothing left now." "That's not my fault," I said. "That's just the bill coming due." We let the silence hang. The market noise filled in around us, the calls of vendors, the clatter of dishes from a nearby cafe, but none of it touched the space between us. Finally, he straightened, or tried to. "You've made your point," he said. "No," I replied. "The point was already there. I just made sure you couldn't ignore it." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, merging into the crowd until he was just another coat, another pair of shoulders, carried by the winter wind. I didn't follow. Some endings don't require witnesses. They just need to be allowed to happen. Walking home, I passed the brownstone one final time. The windows were dark now, the "for sale" sign gone, though I doubted anyone had moved in. It looked like a shell, polished, intact, but empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Back in my kitchen, I placed the last file into the drawer and closed it. The latch clicked softly, not like a trap, but like a door that would not be opened again. I poured the bread from its paper bag onto the counter and broke off a piece. Outside, the river moved under thin ice, carrying the winter toward the harbour. Somewhere out there, Thomas would be learning how to live in the quiet left after noise. And as I stood there, the crust crackling in my hands, I realized that this was not victory, nor vengeance. It was simply the sound of the shaft, sealed and silent, holding its shadow at the bottom.